Well, good morning to you and welcome to day 4 in our journey of Holy Week this year. We find ourselves at what many would call Maundy Thursday. It was the day that Jesus was with his disciples in the upper room as they were celebrating the Seder feast, the Passover Seder feast, which was to reminisce the leaving of Egypt as God rescued the people of Israel from Egypt's captivity. And so this was a meal that they would have annually, and it's a meal that Jesus had said before, I've desired to have this meal with you. And so we find ourselves on day 4, beginning with the Passover meal being shared with his disciples in the upper room. Then we're going to realize that as part of this day, Judas would be identified as his betrayer, and then Jesus would institute what you and I know as the Lord's Supper as a part of this meal as well. He also would inform Peter that he would deny him, and then he would go to the garden along with his disciples to pray. And of course is in the garden where he'll be arrested before the night that he will spend, that will be in torment, torture, and any other words you could find to try to describe what happened. There really are no words that truly describe it. So let's begin today by looking at a few passages of Scripture. Let's pick up the story as the Passover meal is taking place in the upper room. Matthew 26:17 through 25 is where we will find our passage today. And as a matter of fact, we'll be in Matthew 26 the whole day. We begin in verse 17. It says, Now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, Where would you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he said, Go to the city. A certain man will say to him, Teacher, the teacher says, my time is at hand, so I will keep the Passover feast at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had directed, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he reclined at the table with the 12, and as they were eating, he said, Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me. And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, Is it I, Lord? And he answered, He who has dipped his hand in a dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Judas, who would betray him, answered, Is it I, Rabbi? And he said to him, You have said so. As we see this scene unfolding, of course, we realize that Jesus' disciples had asked him where they would like for them to prepare for the meal, and he gave them instructions. One of the other gospel accounts reminds us that as they went into town, Jesus said, You'll see a man carrying a pitcher on his shoulder, and follow him in and tell him the Lord needs to use this place, and he will prepare it for us. And so we realize that this was all part of God's plan. Every step of the way, we see God's hand at work in fulfilling his plan for your salvation and my salvation, where Jesus would ultimately end up on the cross of Calvary. And so this day is a day that is very meaningful in that respect. It shows us more and more of God's plan and how God was working in his plan, even among the 12, as we saw that Judas was identified as the one that would betray Jesus. We saw that in verse 24 and 25, where Jesus said, The Son of Man goes as it is written with him, but woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. And then Judas speaks up and says, Lord or Rabbi, is it I? And he said to him, You have said so. So at that moment around the table, Judas was identified as the betrayer. Another gospel account says that Judas left the room at that point and began to go and find a time. Remember yesterday we ended up with Judas going to the chief priest and the elders, and he received that 30 pieces of silver. So you can imagine what was going through his mind as he heard Jesus say, Whoever's going to betray me, it would be better for that man if he had never been born. Well, then also as a part of the supper, Jesus reveals to Peter that he would one day deny him, and he would soon deny him. Let's pick up in verse 30 and read 30 through 35 of this same passage, and we'll see what he says there. When they'd sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and there Jesus said to them, You will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Then Peter answered him and said, "Lord, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." And Jesus said to him, "Truly, I tell you, this very night before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same. So not only was Judas identified, but Peter was told by Jesus as they were on their way to the Mount of Olives that he would deny him before the rooster crowed the following morning. So we realize that as Jesus is putting together the plan that would lead to your salvation and mine, once again, he is taking care of every detail along the way. Of course, Peter was the one that he spoke specifically to, and you heard, though, the other disciples chimed in and say, "Nor would we." And so we realize that he made a statement there that comes to be very true, that we'll see again, and that is that all of the disciples would be scattered. And then Jesus, of course, is in the garden now, goes to Gethsemane to pray. And in verses 36 through 46, we're reminded of that event in time. He said he went there and he asked the disciples, he said, "Sit there while I go over here and pray." He took with him Peter, James, and John, the sons of Zebedee, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And then he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. So remain here and watch with me." And going a little further, the scripture says, he fell on his face and he prayed, saying, "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And so we see in that prayer in verse 39 there, as Jesus was praying, he said, "Lord, I know all things are possible with you. And if it's possible, if you take this cup of suffering away from me, that would be great. But I don't want you to do what I want to do. I want you to do what will accomplish your will." And what a great prayer. Some have said that this is the moment that the debt was paid for our sin when he surrendered to this death on the cross in the garden, even prior to making it to the cross. And so we realize that it took his obedience under the point of death, as Paul says in Philippians, for God's plan to be fulfilled. And so he told his disciples, "Watch and pray so that you'll not enter temptation." And he used this phrase that the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak, to remind them that God's Spirit will help keep you on the path of righteousness and doing the right thing, but Satan will tempt you to do that which is wrong. And he used the phrase of the flesh being weak, and we all understand that because we know that sometimes in our spirits we want to do something grand for the Lord, but yet our flesh is just weak, and that we end up turning to the things of the flesh, the things of the world, rather than remaining faithful to the things of God. And so Jesus, in this passage, we won't read it all, he goes back and he prays a second time, and he comes back and he finds the disciples sleeping, and then he goes even a third time and he comes back. And then it says this in verse 45, "Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. So rise, let us go. I see that my betrayer is at hand.'" And so here again, God's plan is working out just as the prophets had said it would, and just as Jesus had taught his disciples that it would take place, that he would be betrayed, he would be arrested, he would be falsely accused, he would be crucified. And all of this was taking place to fulfill God's plan. So he was arrested then. Verse 47 is where we pick up with that. And it says, "While he was speaking, Judas, the one of the 12, and with him a great crowd of swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. And the betrayer had given them a sign," he said, or Matthew says, "The one I kiss is the man that you need to seize." And he came to Jesus once and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Then Jesus turned to Judas and he said, "Friend, what do you come to do?" And then they came and laid hands on Jesus, and behold, one of those who with Jesus stretched out his hand, drew his sword, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And then Jesus said, "Put your sword back into place, For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he would at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled, that it must be so? In that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out against me as a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all of this has taken place, that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. So as we see the scene in the garden that night, as he was arrested, we see Judas come to Jesus and betray him with that kiss, that sign he had given to the chief priests and the elders, so that there would be no doubt in their minds who it was that was claiming to be the Messiah. And so as he kissed him, Jesus said, you're going to betray me with a kiss? And so he then left, and Jesus said that in this passage, in Matthew's passage, that one of the disciples took a sword and cut off the ear of one of the servants. And Jesus then spoke up and said, listen, put your swords back. And he gave them that great speech about if you're going to take up a sword, you're going to die by the sword. And then he said something interesting. Do you not think that if I were to appeal to my Father, he couldn't send 12 legions of angels to rescue me? You see, he knew the power of God the Father. He knew God could do anything. He had stated that earlier, that all things are possible with you, Father. But yet he desired the will of the Father to be accomplished more than what he might desire in the flesh. And so he continued, and you saw that last verse as he talked to the crowds about the way in which they came, and they could have arrested him at any time, but now they come to treat him like a robber, and they arrest him under the cover of darkness, and they arrest him with clubs and torches, and then he says this, all this is verse 56, all of this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Everything that took place in all that had taken place to this point, the Last Supper with the disciples, the identifying of Judas as the betrayer, telling Peter he would deny him, all of these things were part of God's plan, and everything that is part of God's plan was going to take place so that the scriptures could be fulfilled. And then that last statement in the verse that we have here in 56 says, then all the disciples left him and fled. And Jesus had told them earlier that all of you would scatter. And so we realized that everything God has put in his plan is taking place. It's recorded for us in the Gospels. Not just in Matthew's Gospel, but in all the Gospels we see the story and can put pieces of the story together. So today, as we think and pray about the events of this day, let's remember that the arrest began a horrific night where Jesus was tortured, was beaten, he was spat upon, he was ridiculed, he was mocked, and he was beaten almost to the point of death. And all of this was to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah 53, that he would be wounded for our transgressions. And all we like sheep had gone astray. And he would be the sacrificial lamb who would take the sin of the world upon his shoulders. So let's think on that tonight. As we go through the evening tonight, just remember, the Lord was suffering in our place, taking upon him our iniquities throughout the course of this night. Well, thank you for joining us today. I hope these have been good for you as we've walked through the week of Holy Week. There will be a video for tomorrow as well, and it will be posted. I will probably post that later today, so it'll be available actually today. But if you want to hold off and wait until tomorrow, that's fine to view it. But of course, tomorrow we'll be looking at that cruel scene of the crucifixion of Christ. And then Saturday, there won't be a video because Saturday was the day that Jesus was in the tomb. And so we will just prayerfully consider on Silent Saturday what we look forward to celebrating on Resurrection Day this Sunday. God bless you. We will see you soon.